Time to talk about public and private partnership, especially at this time in Kenya. We're going to talk about the Big Four, which is really the president's agenda in his last term in office. And there's a lot, in fact, all the four pillars under the Big Four. This is food security and nutrition security, manufacturing, we have healthcare, and also we're looking at housing for all. They are all hinged on a private sector partnership, because all these targets that the government aims to achieve will not happen until the private sector comes to the table and doesn't quite see how to cash out, but sees how to actually complement and assist the government in a shared value aspect to make them a reality.
Right. You know, here at the summit, we're seeing a lot of companies talking about how the shared value model gives them competitive edge, helps their companies grow economically. But a lot of people would say that, you know, some of the social needs that they're addressing is the responsibility of the government. What are your thoughts on that, actually, and how can that be addressed?
Collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. We look at private sector, of course, maximize profit to the shareholders, and the aim is purely on the bottom line. But if you look towards a model on the shared value perspective, where the private sector can sit back and say, hey, wait a minute, if it's the responsibility of government, where does our responsibility lie, and to what extent can we come in into assisting the government achieve its objectives? In a case in point was what was mentioned today by the Chief of Staff and of course the head of the President's Delivery Unit, looking towards, you know, when we talk about aspects to do with, say, for instance, the slum upgrade program. You know, you do not expect the government to do all that by itself, and you can see the private sector having an equal opportunity to come in and assisting in this upgrade.
Right. So you just mentioned your Chief of Staff speaking, and he spoke a bit about corruption and it being the responsibility of both sides, public and private. Can you elaborate on that?
The Chief of Staff's message, especially in this summit, was clear and simple. It's the sense that there's a two-way street in terms of for corruption to take place. You know, and he actually mentioned about a case that is happening in Kenya today, where some officials in the Revenue Authority, of course, are going to be put to task into, the happenings, alleged allegations of corruptions in their offices. And the challenge was that, you know, there is an equal measure of responsibility to the people in the other side of the room, of course, referring to the delegates as well, saying that you are also responsible for the corruption that takes place. So if you look towards the private sector pointing fingers and saying the government needs to sort out corruption, we're also pointing back the fingers and saying, you know what, let's ensure that, you know, the two-way street can actually be cut and make this a collaborative effort, you know. And again, going into the theme of the summit, that it cannot only be tackled, and you cannot just say, you know, it's only the government's responsibility to tackle corruption, as it were. But he also alluded to the fact that the institutions are also very strong and in ensuring that, you know, this will actually be tackled. Because if you look towards the doing business environment, you know, what would the private sector say? You know, the parameters, it always keeps coming up. And if you remember in his speech, he actually took a pause and says, you know what, this is actually something that is right at the core of government, to see how we can strengthen the institutions and ensure that, you know, the next regime, for instance, and even now as we look towards the delivery of the Big Four, corruption will actually be a thing of the past, and we'll focus on the business. And the business here, of course, for government is to ensure that we give the private sector a proper environment to do business.
Right. Are there any plans on behalf of the government to provide some benefits for companies who adapt strategies such as the shared value model, or something similar in which you can collaborate on?
Of course, I'll not give an official pronouncement on the benefits that accrue to private sector, or, you know, on approaching the shared value perspective, but it's more than it meets the eye, I think, and we've been told it's just more than corporate social responsibility. It's really at the core of business. If you look towards the two champions that we've seen in Kenya, Bob Collymore, the CEO of Safaricom, and Joshua Igaro, the CEO of KCB, even in their participation in such a summit and how vocal they have been in supporting the shared value perspective, you can see the mileage that has accrued to both companies. We're talking about KCB and Safaricom, which stand tall, you know, as companies that have, you know, stood the test of time into, you know, technology advancement, seeing how they can, assist the public into doing various programs in the sponsorships they've made. Now, if you look at that as a case study into the perspective they've actually done, they've supported the shared value perspective as two leaders have come strong. I'd call them champions. overall, there is a benefit. Might not be tangible in terms of cash, but there is a brand perspective that accrues to these companies. And I think it's what should be replicated across board, especially with the other organizations. I mean, here we're talking about, Safaricom and KCB, but there still exists many more companies, and especially the small, medium enterprises that are actually just starting to scale in Kenya and the region at large. So there is immense benefit. And again, as I repeat, it's the responsibility of government to support these organizations to ensure that they can actually live up to their billing. Even in your way of doing business, you can still manage to make profits, but still by embracing the shared value perspective.
Right. On the agenda, we have you hosting a plenary about commitments that you mentioned. What would you like to see come out of the event in terms of commitments?
In Kenya, in East Africa, Rwanda, for instance, perspective, I mean, there's just been a whole a plethora, say, of conferences and delegates who fly in, from Harvard, or keynote address, we had speaker from Harvard. Basically, it's a rich continent, and we are rich in conversation. I mean, we're rich in terms of shall I say, the delegates who have the information into how governments can actually scale and assist the private sector in doing business. So in my perspective and in my session, what I'll be looking towards doing is try and stop, pause, take a step back, and see where do we go from here, and ensuring that the delegates in the room, of course, the private sector, the public sector, and of course we have the non-governmental organizations, to actually write commitments and say, you know what, coming in from the summit in 2019, this is what we'd like to achieve. This is what we'd like to achieve. In the next summit, we'll actually be reporting on what has actually happened. We speak at a time when there's a great interest in terms of doing business in East Africa. You're happy to note that the next summit will be in Rwanda, in Kigali. So when we meet in Kigali in 2020, we'll be saying, you know what, during our session, this is what we embarked on doing, the action to take place as well. So when we meet there, we'll be actually reporting on whether the gains and pains that have been experienced in achieving on those goals. So basically, it's moving from talk to action, basically walking the talk.